Hey, are you ready to grow your business? You have checked out the number one resource for business leaders, entrepreneurs, startup founders, and managers. And we're going to teach you how to grow and scale your business with real actionable steps. There's no fluff in this podcast. It's just good advice. Check out this episode. If you're a first-time listener, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoy this episode, leave us a 5-star review. Today's episode is with Robin Rosenberg, who's the CEO and founder of Live in Their World, a company built to help improve workplace culture using modern virtual reality tools. This is absolutely one of the coolest episodes that I've had a chance to record. Robin is a clinical psychologist. We talk a lot about the various things that shape our culture in the workplace, and more importantly, how is virtual reality useful in helping us build a more united, collaborative, diverse, and equal work environment. Check out this episode. Here comes your good advice. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. You know how often we like to talk about culture, management, leadership. It's an important gig, and especially in today's culture of 2021, you would think that we've mastered leadership, that we've figured out leadership, and yet we continue to see story after story of people who were unhappy with their bosses, that were unhappy with their companies, maybe even mismanaged or mistreated in their companies. We're talking today about how can you as the boss or as a leader within your company, how do you develop a culture and an environment where people understand one another, where they respect one another, where every voice is actually heard? How do you develop that culture where people actually love to work, not just for you, but they love the company as a whole? We're going to be talking about that today. And it's actually, this is going to be, I think, one of my favorite episodes, because we're not just talking about leadership. We're talking about pairing leadership with virtual reality, which you may be thinking, wait, did I miss something? What happened here? It's like, yes, we're actually talking about virtual reality today. On today's podcast, we have Dr. Robin Rosenberg. She has a PhD in psychology. She's an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, and she's the CEO and founder of Live in Their World, a company that helps improve workplace culture using modern virtual reality. It's going to be such a cool episode. We're excited to talk about it. Dr. Rosenberg, or should I call you Robin? Which one do you prefer?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay. Robin, it's so great to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Blake. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I have been a PhD candidate. I've been ABD for like ever. And so I try to make sure when someone actually has their doctorate to give them the option of what they would prefer, which most people don't care. But I always like to ask because I know it's a lot of work went into that. And so
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you on. I did actually, now that I'm joking about this, I met someone who she was in an HR position in her company in a Fortune 500. And we were just talking about her PhD. And I said, hey, so what was your dissertation on? And she said, oh, I never ended up finishing it. And everyone called her Dr. So-and-so. And I was like, so you're not a doctor. But anyway, that's totally besides the point. So all that to say, it's great to have you on the show.
Happy to be here.
Well, this is different. I don't think I've had someone on who has your expertise. Tell the audience, tell the listeners, I gave my version of who you are. Who are you and what do you do for a living?
Okay, so I am a clinical psychologist and for many years had a psychotherapy practice and executive coaching. And I write psychology textbooks for college students. And I write for a general audience about you trying to teach nuggets of scientific psychology, just using other people's fictional stories like Harry Potter or the girl with the dragon tattoo or superheroes. But I became interested in virtual reality about 25 years ago because I had been certified in hypnosis. And in hypnosis, there's a phenomenon called dual consciousness or divided consciousness, where you can simultaneously hold the reality of the trance experience and also that you were sitting in my couch in my office, which is why some people feel like they're not hypnotized, because you can hold both of those at the same time. And there was a very early psychology of virtual reality literature that started about 25, 30 years ago. And I started reading it and I thought, wow, this sounds wild. It's that same divided consciousness where when you're wearing an immersive VR headset, you have both the experience of the reality of what's ever in the headset, but you also know that your body is somewhere else in space. So I was just fascinated by that. And I started following the literature until it grew too big to follow anymore. By the way, both hypnosis and VR, when they've done neuroimaging studies, it turns out your brain is registering those experiences as real, which is why they're kind of so cool and successful in giving you an altered perspective. So I was collaborating on some research with a professor at Stanford who's a big American VR psychologist when Trayvon Martin was killed and George Zimmerman was acquitted. And that actually kind of led to a surge in Black Lives Matter. And that led to some white people saying white lives matter or all lives matter. And again, not that I presume to know the lived experience of being Black in the United States, but from my work and reading, I thought that I knew enough to hypothesize that if you could give the people who said all lives matter enough of a dose, if you will, in VR of that lived experience, that they might see things a bit differently. It was a fundamental sort of lack of deep understanding. And that was the idea for the company. And so now what I do is I run Live in Their World. And part of what we do is use virtual reality in part to help people have a deep understanding of what it's like to be an other.
You're talking about unlocking the power of empathy, like for someone to not just cognitively understand that someone has a different lived experience, but to actually feel that and understand that on a deeper level. I mean, that's the potential power of that is pretty incredible, especially mentioning Black Lives Matter. We have so many things that are today's culture is so divided over. Maybe divide is not the right word, but there's a lot of tension over certain concepts. And what I have found is the people who are most resistant are often the ones who are the least knowledgeable on those actual lived experiences. So to have something like a VR world that you could, not to sound, totally, I don't want to reduce it too much, but, you plug in and you can actually live in that world or get that experience. I think the implications of that's pretty exciting. And it sounds like your work on a day-to-day basis is incredibly exciting for what you get to do.
It is exciting. And, the most important thing to me, of course, is do no harm on the way to doing good. And so some DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion interventions actually can do harm. And so it was very important to me before I leapt in with both feet to make sure that we weren't doing harm. So we did a pilot study, and the results of that were, the data were terrific. And the comments that we got from people who had the experience, again, we were not doing harm and also doing good. So that was really exciting. And I should say there are different pieces, and part of what we're doing and what I'm most interested in doing is ultimately behavior change. We spend so much of our time in our work lives, whether it's remote or in office now. And even with remote work, we can be disrespected just as easily, if not more so, than in the office. And so really what we're about is what we call civility training, which is about respect, which is how do you convey respect to people who are the same as you or different than you, and we're all in some sense the same and we're all in some sense different, and how to take in information in a respectful way. And that requires habit change. And that's where empathy comes in, because, as a psychologist, we know a lot about habit change. And so you need three pieces or three strands or three elements. One is motivation. It's hard to learn a new habit. Just like learning to wear a mask when you go out, or, we were hopeful we could learn not to wear a mask when we go out. Remembering to put sunscreen on, whatever it is, it's hard to learn a new habit. And that's where empathy comes in. It's really critical, because once you deeply understand and empathize, that gives you the reason to do the work. Right. So, because empathy is great, but in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily help you to do anything differently, and certainly not over time. The second strand is you have to understand and know, well, what should I be doing instead? If I'm not supposed to do X, Y, and Z, what do I do? And I like to use the analogy of giving a kid crayons and they draw on the floor. And so it's not enough to say, no, don't draw on the floor. You have to say, you draw on paper. And here's where we keep the paper. So whenever you want to draw, just take out the paper.
I have a 1-year-old. This is really good for me. So I'm taking notes. These are great insights.
Yes. So always the no comes with, well, what should I do instead?
Yeah.
Don't hit your brother. Instead, you should do this when you're angry. So that's the second strand is, well, what do I do instead, or what I do differently? And then the third strand is really helping people learn and then maintain that new behavior over time. It's really like language learning. And if you don't practice, you just, if you don't use it, you lose it. So many of these one-off DEI interventions, even the ones that are really good and powerful and moving, if they're not systemically supported, people forget about them and they just go back to whatever their habit is. And so our goal is to attack all of those three.
So let's talk about that third one. What does it look like for a company to legitimately develop that kind of systemic support for internal change? Because I think a lot of times what ends up happening is what you mentioned. It's that one-off training that either it's led internally or someone's paid to come in and speak for 4 hours. And there's a lot of it's easy to pat yourself on the back and say, okay, we did it. We are diverse and inclusive. And it's kind of like the way I pair it is I think of like when we talk about culture, developing a strong work culture, what'll happen is a group of executives will like throw lunch. They'll grab lunch for everyone and like throw like a pizza party or something. And they'll say, yeah, we made our culture. And yet like there's a manager who's abusive or is micromanaging, or maybe even worse things that are happening where employees are maybe even fearful of telling people about their experiences. So there's this gap, there's this disconnect between what that single one-off moment and what is the actual reality of the lived experiences of the employees. To develop a diverse and inclusive workplace, what are some of the ways you've encouraged your customers to really habit form towards real meaningful change?
Terrific question. Let me try to prioritize the multiple ways.
I have a really bad habit, by the way, of asking like long tiered questions. So you just pick it apart whichever way you want to, and we'll get to it. No,
that's great. It's great. So one of the things is that our program is not a one and done. It's really a subscription as a service over the course of the year. And so that's part one, right? So that and then another piece of that is that we recommend at minimum teams go through the program at approximately the same cadence. And that's important so that everyone knows what's expected of them, right? This is the second element, which is, well, what should I do instead? Is that we we tell you what to do instead, right? Sort of what is respectful behavior is really, in some sense, it may be more complicated, but in another sense, it's not. The fundamental aspects of being respectful are the same no matter what someone's demographic group is, or demographic identity. So if you're telling people what they should be doing, then for leaders, the idea is you have to actually now walk the walk. Mm. And that can be very challenging for many reasons. And so then you need help in doing that. So for instance, let's take team meetings, because that's just a good example, especially as we're remote, because that's the way really culture is transmitted, is through sort of team or other larger group meetings. If you see someone or hear someone doing something disrespectful, so as a leader, what do? You could let it, well, first there's noticing it, right? If you don't notice it, you can't do anything. And so how does the organization help you notice that? So you may have a rotating team position of process person, where people rotate being in charge of really just looking at process. And it helps everyone then become aware, which is good. You want everyone to be aware. When you see something, how do you say something as a leader? If you wait to do it in private, that can be more respectful of the person who said the thing, right? You don't want to, quote, call them out. However, other people who also saw that there were no consequences for it. Mm. And so then what happens is it becomes it's allowed. People think that it is allowed and it's a norm. And so this is where, the soft skills for leadership become so important, because it's how do you intervene in a way that's really respectful to everybody? Because the shame and blame isn't particularly helpful, ultimately. It just makes people scared that they're going to get shamed and blamed. So it's how do you do that? And part of that is having group guidelines explicitly to talk about, hey, do we interrupt here?
Yeah.
Mm. Let's just take that as an example. Do we interrupt? If so, why? What are the costs? Right. So it's a discussion. It actually can be a really bonding, helpful discussion of just about values. And that's great, because by the end of the discussion, or if not, then by next week, there should be a guideline about interrupting and what the group either consensus or what, you as leader decide, and then be really clear about that. And what happens when people interrupt is, it's just, hey, remember, this is our guideline. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there's so much great data out there around open communication and candid dialogue, and the boss understanding sometimes it's less about top down, this is what everyone needs to do, and more of I'm a collaborator of helping people communicate those expectations and set the stage for how do we work together. What's interesting is, as I'm just listening to it, I'm thinking about this. Some of the stuff feels like, I guess when we're talking about like from a theoretical point of view, some of it feels like it should be very simple. Treating people respectfully seems like this should be really easy. And I don't dislike the respect term. I just know I've met people who've been like, what? I was being respectful. And I was like, no, you didn't like yell at the person, but you were actually still being very hurtful. Or like, I wasn't doing anything wrong. And the term I think of beyond that is like giving dignity to someone. Like, how are you giving dignity to the person you were interacting with? And again, this feels like a very simple concept that I think about, like all of our childhoods, like our parents teaching us, like, don't be an awful person. Yet it feels like in the actual workplace, it gets very complicated and it's not so simple. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's, I don't know what it is. I don't know why it feels so clunky when people start working together in an office. Why does it feel like when we talk through these issues that it should be clear how we should behave, and yet it gets so challenging in the day-to-day process?
I actually don't think it should be clear. I mean, there is a sense in which it's clear, but there's a sense in which it isn't, because people have different backgrounds. I think just thinking about time, right? That's a great example where, someone who's habitually late, I may experience that as disrespectful to me in my time, right?
Right.
And they may be oblivious that is, to me, a sign of disrespect, right? Or not starting meetings on time, the people who show up on, I mean, these are just a little example, but we are all raised with a range of possible anchors of values. And so what is respectful to one person isn't necessarily respectful to another. And that's the thing about having the team conversations. It is complicated. Having said that, none of us is ever going to get it all right because we are different. And so I think the real goal is about having communication and openness and curiosity. So if you tell me, hey, I'm really mindful of time, and if you're late, I hear that, it lands on me, it feels disrespectful to me, for me to be open to hearing that. Oh, I didn't know, that wasn't my intention, but I will now be more mindful about showing up on time or contacting you if I can't. So it's that conversation of how we get to know each other that we really want to have.
Doesn't it? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, it's just good.
Well, I was just going to ask, it seems like the companies that, and I don't want to put it too simply, it seems like the companies that have, frankly, good leadership more naturally, intuitively lean into what you're talking about. Like I can envision, for example, going to some kind of event and you're the guest speaker, and me thinking, well, I want to be a good boss, and I want that to be my work environment, and grabbing your business card and giving you a call and saying, hey, we want to work together. I'm also thinking about, frankly, the horror stories that we all have of that bad boss. I think it's very relatable, that Sunday night feeling of, oh gosh, I don't know if I can go to work again. I was reading an awful story about a woman who was so stressed about going back to her job, was so mistreated by her boss that her hair was falling out. And I think about just the exhaustion that some of the people listening to the podcast might even be facing now with their job. What do you do when you find yourself working with businesses, and maybe they don't want your help, I don't know, but working with businesses who their habits are so far gone in the negative direction? Do you ever find yourself working with people who are just unwilling to change, or unwilling to change their habits, their behaviors, especially bosses, their communication style, especially if it's a boss who's maybe they've been in their leadership position for 20 years and it's just who I am? What do you do with that?
Yes. So if it's an individual who is has that perspective, it's actually potentially workable, because otherwise, why are we involved? Somebody has brought us in. And so, one of the things that we know is what a growth mindset, which is the idea that I can learn, I have the capability to grow and change. People who with a growth mindset do much better in organizations these days than people with what's called a fixed mindset, which you just described, which is, this is how I am.
Yeah.
As if I am unchangeable. And so sometimes you can get people, with my coaching work and our coaching work, you can see where you can get people motivated to do the work because there are consequences for them if they don't. They don't have to change their fundamental beliefs. They have to at least act incredibly well, so it looks like they have. Because it affects the organization, it affects attrition, it affects branding. Mm-hmm. If you are a bad boss and not particularly interested in learning to be a better boss, it's very bad for your organization. So if they're bringing us in, they want you to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like your work has you have a multitude of opportunities to see some really rewarding things happen. I think back to that employee who is nervous and stressed and exhausted, and to have someone like you come in and sort of, those are the stories that really matter. The company that is going one way and they realize, hey, we haven't developed the culture we want, and they're willing to shift and go an entirely different way. And you have employees who say, hey, I hated it here, and now I really like it here. Now I really feel valued and appreciated. What's some of the best parts of your job on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day basis, well, the best parts are always where I can be directly helpful versus indirectly helpful. It's just more rewarding. I think finding new ways to be helpful is incredibly rewarding. So, with new coaching clients, or we have leadership training that isn't a one and done, because one and dones don't work. So of course we're using science of learning around our leadership training, and just hearing, the ways that we have been helpful is incredibly rewarding. That's, I run into people who were in our pilot program, and a year later, they're telling me the ways that they changed their behavior because it was so impactful. And that was incredibly gratifying.
Well, talk to me about one of the things I like to do with people who come on the show is the nitty-gritty journey of actually starting a business. I think it's fun for my listeners. Some of my listeners they're in it. They've been running their own businesses. Other ones of my listeners are in their 9-to-5 job, and they listen to the podcast to live vicariously through someone like yourself. So you came across, you found this world of VR, and you saw the opportunity there to really help businesses in a meaningful way. What did it look like to actually start the business? I'm even curious, to start to pitch and promote the business. What were people's reactions? What's the growth journey looked like for you?
So it's been fascinating and somewhat atypical. I had the idea, and I was living in San Francisco at the time, and knew some venture capitalists, because if you live in the Bay Area in a certain,
sure,
that's it's in the water, right? And so I mentioned the idea and said, I'm not a business person. If you know someone who can make use of this, I'd be happy to tell them more about it. The VC thought it was a really good idea. That was that. I had business. I already had a job, a day job I loved. And then Me Too happened, and the VC contacted me after Me Too, or during Me Too era. And he said, remember that idea you had? We'd like to fund you to do a proof of concept for gender. So I agreed to do that on the side. And that was the pilot that I was telling you about, making sure that we could do good and it wasn't harmful. And so we got the data, and it was so good. And the comments we got were so good that I felt like if I can make a difference, that was my new calling. So,
and were these men who were?
These were men of any color who were experiencing the perspective of Anna, a white woman who was 35. And it's really just kind of scene after scene of what typically women of any color go through. The character, Anna was white, but it was just, the extra burden.
I'm just so curious. I want to try it. I'm just like, this is so intriguing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your story, by the way.
That's okay.
I'm just commenting as I'm listening. So
we can get together afterwards. Happy to have you experience it.
So anyway, you did this pilot study. It was incredibly successful. And from there.
So from there, I, had this whole crisis about whether to stop what I had been trained to do for many years and was now quite good at, and do this other thing. And, thought about it and talked to friends and family for a month, but really felt like if I could move the needle, that was my mission. So I did. And so I started doing this full time and learned an enormous number of skills that, I tried to learn an enormous number of skills that I didn't have, which was incredibly exciting, by the way. Just to really be learning so many new things at the same time was really quite fun. And sorting through the things I liked to learn versus the things I wasn't so enthusiastic about learning was also interesting and revealed things about myself to me. So, and then there were different things I was learning at different points in the gearing up process. I don't know if you have specific questions, but
no. I the thing I'm thinking about is, I think one of the things I really value about guests like you who come on the podcast who has started a business, you're running a business, is in the entrepreneurship world of, I'm going to go start a business. It feels like there's people in two different buckets. There's people who I come across who say, I really want to be an entrepreneur. I really want to leave my 9-to-5. I want to go make something of myself. It sounds very stereotypical only because that's very common, this same line of conversation that I end up having. Right. And then there's this other bucket of people who've started a business who I saw a need that I thought I could help solve. And it's very customer focused and customer centric. And there's a demographic or there's individuals who I know have a need. They have a problem that needs to be solved. And I want to add to that. And I would put you into that second bucket of being very much customer centric and customer focused. And it seems like people who I have on the podcast who are running really cool businesses are also in that same line of thinking. Of just thinking about, okay, there's good that I want to do for people. How do I take my skill set and my insights and add to that? Rather than it, I guess the temptation for a lot of us as business owners, or speaking for myself, the temptation for myself is, what am I building for my legacy or my brand or my, which isn't inherently a wrong question. It's just, I think we get into trouble when my own personal ego becomes more important than maybe the customers that I'm actually helping. Not so much a question for you, just an appreciation of your journey. Because I like hearing stories of people who have started businesses out of a desire to help people. And that sounds like that's what you're doing.
Thank you. It is a desire to help people, but it started with an idea, with an hypothesis, and just kind of mulling over about VR and if sort of if George Zimmerman, if that whole arc hadn't happened right then, I don't know that I would have thought of it because VR was top of mind around the time that he was killed and George Zimmerman was acquitted because I was doing the research. So that's a lot of the fortuitous journey for entrepreneurs. It's out of COVID, there are all kinds of new startups that have happened for various and sundry reasons. And as you know, the entrepreneurship journey is really such a roller coaster. The irony for me is I had been doing executive coaching for startup founders. And so I thought I knew, and I had family members who were startup founders, but it's like having kids. You could babysit all you want and have nieces and nephews, and it's just not the same.
I love it. So true. Well, Robin, it has been so great having you on the podcast today. Anything else you want to share about your business, Live in the World?
Just to let people know about your program, feel free to contact me. I'm sure the ways to contact me are in the notes, but it's robin@liveintheirworld.com. We have downloads, freebies. Just go to our website with /publishing, and there's always a white paper on there that people can have. The current one is giving and receiving feedback, best practices, although it may be different by the time some listeners get there. And leadership training, executive coaching, and our VR program.
Robin, it was great having you on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Blake. It's been great. Great questions. Thanks.
Great. Dr. Robin Rosenberg on the podcast today, and I'm going to put her contact information. I'm also going to put the website, liveintheworld.com. It's going to be down in the episode description below, which, by the way, if you enjoyed this episode, what the heck you waiting on? Click that subscribe button, click that follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are, and you can keep listening to great guests like Robin on the podcast. Also, don't forget, if you love the podcast, you want to support the podcast, you can go to our Patreon. It's patreon.com/goodadvice, where you could even get your business sponsored in the introduction of the podcast. Again, go to our Patreon at patreon.com/goodadvice. And as always, I appreciate your support, and we'll catch you later. See ya.